Today we're telling the fascinating biblical story of pharaohs in the Bible. I know a lot of people have pointed out issues with my visuals, and honestly, I get it. I'll admit I don't always get them right because I have zero skills in perfecting visual edits. But here's the thing, the message is what truly matters. If the visuals are a distraction, feel free to turn your phone face down and just listen. I promise I'll keep working to improve them. Also, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I'll do my best to respond. If you're short on time, feel free to use the timestamps in the description below. But honestly, watching the whole video will give you the complete picture and bring this captivating story to life. And hey, before we start, if you love exploring the Bible and want to deepen your faith, take a second to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps more people discover the channel and grow in their understanding of the Bible. All right, let's get started. Pharaohs were the rulers of ancient Egypt, serving as both political leaders and religious figures. The title Pharaoh wasn't simply a term for a king. It represented a god on earth chosen by the divine powers to maintain order and balance in the world. Ancient Egyptians viewed their pharaoh as the crucial intermediary between the gods and the people. They believed pharaohs were deities in human form, specifically the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god associated with kingship, and later as the son of Amun-Ra, the supreme deity of Egypt. This deeply held belief granted pharaohs absolute authority throughout the kingdom, with their commands considered divine law that could not be questioned. Egypt stood as one of the most formidable and advanced civilizations of the ancient world. The life-giving Nile River blessed the land with exceptional fertility, ensuring consistent food production and economic prosperity. This stability allowed pharaohs to accumulate immense wealth and resources, which they directed toward creating monumental structures that continue to amaze us today. Pyramids reaching toward the heavens, elaborate temples honoring the gods, and colossal statues commemorating their reign. The rule of the pharaohs was characterized not just by military campaigns and territorial expansion, but also by elaborate religious ceremonies and the construction of vast burial complexes designed to guarantee their successful journey into the afterlife. Pharaohs exercised complete control over their subjects, issuing decrees that influenced every aspect of Egyptian life, from agricultural practices to trade regulations and religious observances. By the time biblical narratives began to unfold, Egypt had already established itself as a sophisticated empire with a complex political hierarchy, an extensive and powerful priesthood, and a thoroughly established system of slavery. Foreigners who entered Egyptian territory frequently found themselves forced into servitude, either laboring on the pharaoh's enormous construction projects or serving as household slaves for the elite. The pharaoh relied on a network of trusted advisors, priests, and military commanders who were instrumental in maintaining the state's authority and ensuring Egypt remained the dominant power throughout the region. Egypt's considerable influence and strategic importance meant that it featured prominently in biblical narratives, interacting with the Hebrew people in ways that profoundly shaped their historical journey. From providing sanctuary during times of famine to becoming a land of harsh oppression, Egypt played a crucial role in the unfolding of God's divine plan for His people. The pharaohs, as the supreme rulers of Egypt, became central figures in these interactions, occasionally showing generosity and hospitality, but more often displaying stubborn resistance to God's will. which ultimately led to dramatic divine interventions that demonstrated God's power over even the mightiest human kingdoms. One of the earliest recorded encounters between a biblical figure and a pharaoh took place during the time of Abraham. The account is found in Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 to 20. When Abraham, who was then known as Abram, journeyed to Egypt to escape a famine in Canaan. In the ancient world, this was a common course of action. Egypt, sustained by the steady flow of the Nile, often became a refuge for those facing drought and food shortages. However, as Abraham and his household approached the land, fear began to take hold of him. Sarah, his wife, was strikingly beautiful, and Abraham worried that the Egyptians might kill him to take her. Overcome by fear, he devised a plan and asked Sarah to tell the Egyptians that she was his sister rather than his wife. Genesis chapter 12, verses 11 to 13 describes his thoughts and instructions. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." At first, Abraham's plan seemed to work. Pharaoh's officials took notice of Sarah and, impressed by her beauty, praised her before Pharaoh himself. Believing her to be unmarried, Pharaoh brought her into his household. He also treated Abraham well, rewarding him with livestock, donkeys, camels, and servants. As a result, Abraham became wealthy. But while everything appeared to be going in his favor, trouble soon arose. God intervened by sending severe plagues upon Pharaoh and his household. Though the Bible does not specify the exact nature of these plagues, they were serious enough to capture Pharaoh's attention and make him realize something was wrong. Genesis chapter 12, verse 17 states, "But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai." Pharaoh quickly came to understand that Sarah was not merely Abraham's sister, she was his wife. Unlike some of the later pharaohs who would harden their hearts against divine warnings, this ruler responded immediately. Genesis chapter 12, verses 18 to 19 records his reaction. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." Despite being deceived, Pharaoh did not seek revenge. Instead, he simply ordered Abraham to leave Egypt. This is a stark contrast to the later pharaohs in the Bible, who often resisted God's will with defiance. This pharaoh, however, demonstrated an immediate awareness of divine authority and acted accordingly. This moment in biblical history holds deep significance. It marks the first recorded instance of a pharaoh experiencing God's intervention on behalf of Abraham and his descendants. It also highlights key themes that would continue throughout Scripture: divine protection, human weakness, and how fear can lead even a faithful man to act deceitfully. Abraham, though chosen by God, relied on deception in a moment of uncertainty. Yet despite his failure to fully trust, God still preserved both him and Sarah. The Pharaoh in Joseph's story and the oppressive Pharaoh of Moses' birth. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, who were consumed by jealousy over his favored status in their father Jacob's household. Joseph was taken by Midianite traders and brought to Egypt. There, he was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Though the Bible does not name this Pharaoh, he ruled at a time when Egypt was one of the most powerful nations in the world. His governance depended heavily on dream interpretation and the wisdom of his priests and magicians, who advised him on matters of the kingdom. Joseph's life took another devastating turn when he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, who claimed he had attempted to assault her. Though innocent, Joseph was thrown into prison. Even in confinement, he remained faithful to God, and in time, his ability to interpret dreams became known. While in prison, he interpreted the dreams of two of Pharaoh's servants, the cupbearer and the baker. His predictions came true. The cupbearer was restored to his position, while the baker was executed. Despite this, Joseph remained in prison for 2 more years, forgotten by the cupbearer. Then Pharaoh himself had troubling dreams that none of his magicians or wise men could explain. In Genesis chapter 41, verses 1-8, the Bible describes Pharaoh's distress over his visions. 7 fat cows emerged from the Nile, only to be devoured by 7 lean cows. Likewise, 7 healthy ears of grain were swallowed up by 7 thin, scorched ones. These dreams deeply unsettled Pharaoh, and when no one could interpret them, the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. Without delay, Pharaoh summoned Joseph from prison. When asked if he could interpret the dreams, Joseph made it clear that the ability came from God alone. Genesis chapter 41, verses 25-30 records Joseph's interpretation. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years. And so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine." Joseph warned Pharaoh that Egypt would experience 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. He advised Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning leader to oversee the collection of surplus grain during the years of plenty, so that the nation would be prepared for the years of scarcity. Pharaoh was astonished by Joseph's wisdom. Recognizing that God's Spirit was with him, Pharaoh elevated Joseph to the highest position in Egypt, second only to himself. Genesis chapter 41, verse 41 records this moment of transformation. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Joseph's rise to power was extraordinary. Pharaoh gave him an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, and arranged for him to marry Asenath, the daughter of a prominent priest. Under Joseph's leadership, Egypt flourished. Vast amounts of grain were stored in preparation for the coming famine. And when the years of famine arrived, people from surrounding nations came to Egypt in search of food, including Joseph's own brothers, who had once betrayed him. This Pharaoh proved to be a wise and perceptive ruler. He valued Joseph's counsel and recognized that his ability came from God. Because of Joseph's service, Pharaoh extended kindness to the Hebrew people. He welcomed Joseph's family into Egypt and allowed them to settle in the fertile land of Goshen, providing them with a place to prosper. For a time, this marked a period of peace between Egypt and the Hebrews. Pharaoh honored the man who had saved his nation and, in doing so, treated his people with favor. But this era of goodwill would not last forever. Eventually, a new Pharaoh arose, one who did not know Joseph. And with his rise to power, the relationship between Egypt and the Hebrews would take a dark and painful turn, setting the stage for their oppression and eventual deliverance. The peaceful relationship between Egypt and the Hebrews came to a devastating end when a new pharaoh rose to power, one who did not see the Israelites as honored guests, but as a growing threat. Exodus chapter 1 verse 8 states, "Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt." This pharaoh, though unnamed in the Bible, is believed by some scholars to have been a ruler from Egypt's 18th dynasty. He saw that the Israelite population had grown tremendously, and he feared that if war ever broke out, they might side with Egypt's enemies. His response to this perceived threat was not diplomacy or restraint, but oppression. The Israelites, who had once been welcomed in Egypt under Joseph's influence, were now forced into brutal slavery. They were subjected to relentless labor, building cities like Pithom and Ramesses, which served as supply centers for Pharaoh's empire. But despite the heavy burden placed on them, their numbers continued to grow. This only deepened the Egyptians' resentment and fear. Exodus chapter 1 verse 12 describes the situation, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. Pharaoh's attempts to weaken the Israelites through forced labor failed, so he turned to something even more horrifying. He ordered the systematic killing of Hebrew baby boys. To stop their population growth, he summoned the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and commanded them to kill every male infant at birth. But these women feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. They refused to obey. Exodus chapter 1 verse 17 reveals their courage. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. When Pharaoh discovered their defiance, he demanded an explanation. The midwives responded with a clever answer, telling him that Hebrew women were strong and gave birth before they could even arrive. Because of their faithfulness, God blessed them. But Pharaoh was not finished. His next decree was even more ruthless. Exodus chapter 1 verse 22 records his final chilling order. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." This was one of the darkest moments in Israel's history. Mothers were forced to surrender their newborn sons, and countless infants perished in the waters of the Nile. The pain and grief among the Hebrew people were unimaginable. But even amid this horror, God was working to bring about deliverance. It was during this time of terror that a Levite woman named Jochebed gave birth to a son. Knowing Pharaoh's decree, she hid her child for 3 months. When she could no longer keep him hidden, she placed him in a papyrus basket and set it afloat on the Nile, hoping he would be spared. In a remarkable turn of events, Pharaoh's daughter found the baby and, moved with compassion, decided to adopt him. The irony could not have been greater. The very household that had ordered the deaths of Hebrew boys would now raise the one who would one day deliver Israel from slavery. Unlike the Pharaoh of Joseph's time, who had recognized God's hand in Joseph's wisdom, this Pharaoh had no reverence for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His rule was marked by fear, cruelty, and a determination to maintain absolute control. He had no idea that his actions were setting the stage for a confrontation that would shake Egypt to its core, a battle between the ruler of the most powerful kingdom on earth and the God who had chosen Israel as his own. Moses, raised as an Egyptian prince, would one day return to challenge the Pharaoh of his time. But before that day came, the suffering of his people would leave a lasting mark. The Hebrews, once welcomed in Egypt, had now become a nation enslaved. Yet even in their oppression, their cries for deliverance would not go unheard. They waited, longing for God to answer, not knowing that their deliverance was already beginning to unfold. The Pharaoh who confronted Moses. The reign of the Pharaoh who ruled during Moses' time would become one of the most defining moments in biblical history. He was not like the Pharaoh who had once favored Joseph, nor was he the same ruler who had ordered the death of Hebrew infants at the time of Moses' birth. This Pharaoh, whose identity remains debated among historians, often suggested to be Ramesses II or Amenhotep II, was a ruler who openly defied God's direct commands. His heart was hardened against divine intervention, and his stubbornness led to some of the most catastrophic plagues Egypt had ever seen. By the time Moses returned to Egypt, he was no longer a prince in Pharaoh's household, but a man on a mission from God. After encountering the Lord at the burning bush, Moses was given a command to go before Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites. But he would not go alone. His brother Aaron would stand beside him as his spokesperson. Together they confronted Pharaoh for the first time. Exodus chapter 5 verse 1 records this pivotal moment. Afterward Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's reaction was not one of fear or consideration. Instead, it was filled with arrogance and defiance. Exodus chapter 5 verse 2 captures his response. Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." This Pharaoh did not recognize the God of Israel. To him the gods of Egypt reigned supreme, and the Hebrew slaves were nothing more than laborers to be controlled. Rather than granting their release, Pharaoh responded by increasing their oppression. He ordered that the Israelites must continue making bricks, but now without being provided straw. This forced them to work even harder, searching for their own materials while still meeting the same quotas. The suffering of the Israelites intensified, and instead of rallying behind Moses, they turned against him. They accused him of making their situation even worse, questioning why he had returned at all. To them, his presence had brought more hardship, not the freedom he had promised. But what they could not yet see was that God was preparing to reveal his power in ways that would shake Egypt to its core. What followed was not just a conflict between a Hebrew prophet and an Egyptian king. It was a confrontation between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. Pharaoh had hardened his heart, but he had no idea that he was about to witness a series of events that would make it impossible to deny the authority of the Lord. The 10 plagues that came upon Egypt were not random disasters. Each one struck at the heart of Egypt's religious system, proving that the God of Israel reigned above all. Pharaoh's refusal to listen would not only lead to the downfall of his kingdom, but would also set the stage for the greatest deliverance in Israel's history. Moses had come to demand freedom, and whether Pharaoh liked it or not, God's plan was already in motion. Egypt would never be the same again. The first plague struck at the very heart of Egypt's existence. The waters of the Nile turned to blood. This was not just a disaster, it was a direct challenge to Hapi, the Egyptian god believed to be the spirit of the Nile, the very source of life for the nation. The river which sustained crops, provided drinking water, and symbolized prosperity became undrinkable and foul. Fish died, and the stench filled the land. But despite the suffering, Pharaoh refused to listen. His magicians managed to replicate the sign, giving him just enough reason to harden his heart and dismiss Moses' warning. Then came the second plague, a massive infestation of frogs. These creatures poured into homes, covered the streets, and even invaded Pharaoh's palace. The Egyptians worshipped Heket, the goddess of fertility who was often depicted as a frog. Instead of being a sign of life and blessing, frogs now became a curse, overwhelming the land. Pharaoh briefly wavered, asking Moses to pray for relief, but as soon as the frogs died off, he changed his mind and refused to let the Israelites go. The third and fourth plagues only added to Egypt's misery. First, gnats swarmed the land, covering people and animals, making life unbearable. Then came the flies, relentless and consuming, invading every home and every corner of Egypt. These plagues directly challenged Geb, the god of the earth, and Khepri, the god of insects and rebirth. The land was defiled, the air thick with pestilence, and yet Pharaoh remained unmoved. Then came a devastating blow. The fifth plague struck Egypt's livestock. Cattle, donkeys, sheep, and horses died in massive numbers, crippling the nation's economy. Hathor, the cow goddess of protection, was powerless to stop it. Pharaoh sent men to investigate and found that none of the Israelites' livestock had been touched. Still, he refused to let them go. The sixth plague followed swiftly. Painful boils broke out on the people and animals of Egypt. This struck at the heart of their faith in Sekhmet, the goddess of healing. Even Pharaoh's magicians, who had once tried to imitate Moses' signs, were now covered in sores and unable to stand before him. But Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. The seventh plague brought destruction from the sky. Hail rained down with such force that it killed any person or animal left in the open and shattered crops across the land. This was an undeniable challenge to Nut, the sky goddess, Seth, the god of storms, and Shu, the god of the air. Those who listened to Moses and sought shelter were spared, but Pharaoh once again refused to yield. With the land already suffering, the eighth plague arrived, swarms of locusts. They devoured everything the hail had not already destroyed, leaving Egypt barren. Starvation loomed. Pharaoh's officials, his most trusted advisors, begged him to let the Israelites go, warning that Egypt was on the brink of ruin. For a moment he seemed to consider it, but as soon as the locusts were gone, he turned back to his defiance. Then came the ninth plague, one that struck at the core of Egypt's religion. Darkness covered the land for 3 days. This was not just an eclipse or a passing shadow. It was thick, suffocating darkness, unlike anything Egypt had ever experienced. The great sun god, Ra, the most powerful deity in their pantheon, was silent. The message was clear. Egypt's gods were powerless against the God of Israel. And yet Pharaoh still would not submit. Then came the final, most devastating plague, the death of the firstborn. This was no longer just a strike against Egypt's gods. It was a direct blow to Pharaoh himself, who was considered a god on earth. At midnight, death swept through Egypt. Every firstborn son, from the heir to Pharaoh's throne to the children of prisoners, was taken. Even the firstborn of the livestock perished. Exodus chapter 12, verse 29 describes the moment. At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. The grief that spread through Egypt was unbearable. The very nation that had once commanded the slaughter of Hebrew infants was now mourning the loss of its children. Pharaoh, broken and defeated, finally ordered Moses and the Israelites to leave. But his surrender would not last. Even in his loss, his heart would harden once more, setting the stage for one final confrontation between the armies of Egypt and the God of Israel. After the Israelites had left Egypt, Pharaoh was forced to confront the full weight of what had happened. It was not just that he had lost his workforce. His pride had been shattered, his kingdom lay in ruins, and his gods had been exposed as powerless. Worst of all, he had lost his own son. Yet even in the face of such devastating loss, his heart hardened once more. His grief and anger turned into a thirst for revenge. He could not accept defeat. Determined to reclaim his authority, he gathered his army, his finest chariots, and his most skilled warriors, and set out in pursuit of the Israelites. Meanwhile, the Israelites, having left Egypt in haste, soon found themselves in a terrifying predicament. Before them stretched the Red Sea, an impassable barrier, and behind them the dust clouds of Pharaoh's approaching army darkened the horizon. Panic gripped them. Fear overtook their faith. They turned on Moses, their leader, crying out in despair. Exodus chapter 14, verses 11 to 12, captures their desperation. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Their fear was raw, their doubt overwhelming. But Moses, standing firm in his trust in God, responded with unwavering faith. He reassured them with words that would echo throughout history. Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 to 14, records his response. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." And then the impossible happened. God commanded Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea. In an instant the waters split apart, forming towering walls on either side and revealing a dry path through the depths. The Israelites, in awe and urgency, stepped forward and began their journey across the sea. Behind them, Pharaoh and his army pursued with relentless determination, charging into the passage. But just as they entered, God intervened. Exodus chapter 14, verses 24 to 25 describes the scene. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Too late. Pharaoh's army realized they were not just chasing escaped slaves. They were fighting against the very God of Israel. As the last of the Israelites stepped onto the far shore, Moses stretched out his hand once more. The walls of water came crashing down, swallowing the Egyptian army. Exodus chapter 14, verse 28 declares the final blow. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. Pharaoh, the man who had once scoffed, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" had now seen the answer with his own eyes. He had challenged the God of Israel, and in doing so, he had lost everything. His pride, his army, and his power had been washed away in the very waters through which God had delivered his people. The Pharaoh who had once ruled over the Israelites was no longer the master of their fate. Their chains had been broken, their bondage was over, and their journey toward the promised land had begun. Egypt, the mighty empire that had enslaved them for generations, had been brought to its knees, not by swords or rebellion, but by the power of the living God. The pharaohs later mentioned in the Old Testament after the account of the Exodus. As the centuries passed after the Exodus, Egypt remained a dominant kingdom, constantly seeking influence over Canaan and the surrounding regions. The relationship between Egypt and Israel evolved in many ways. Some pharaohs offered refuge while others posed threats. At times, Egypt played a key role in the shifting alliances that shaped the politics of the ancient Near East. One of the most well-known interactions between Israel and Egypt during this later period occurred in the time of King Solomon. Solomon, celebrated for his wisdom and grand construction projects, and secured a marriage alliance with Egypt by taking a pharaoh's daughter as his wife. 1 Kings. Chapter 3, verse 1 states, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. This alliance was not just a personal union. It was a strategic move that aligned Israel with one of the most powerful nations of the time. Marrying into the Egyptian royal family demonstrated the rising status of Israel on the international stage. While the Bible does not name the pharaoh involved, some scholars suggest he may have been Susenus II or Siamun, rulers of Egypt's 21st dynasty. Years later, during the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam, Egypt again made its presence felt, this time as an adversary. The pharaoh Shishak, identified as Shishak I, launched an attack on Jerusalem. By this time, the once united kingdom of Israel had split in two, with Rehoboam ruling over Judah. His reign was turbulent, marked by instability and internal divisions. 1 Kings. Chapter 14, verses 25 to 26 describe the invasion. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak king of Egypt attacked Jerusalem. He carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including all the gold shields Solomon had made. This was a devastating moment for Judah. The wealth and splendor of Solomon's reign had been a source of pride, and now the golden treasures of the temple, once symbols of divine blessing and prosperity, were stripped away by an Egyptian king. This act not only signaled Judah's vulnerability, but also reinforced Egypt's ability to influence and overpower its neighbors when the opportunity arose. Egypt's involvement in Israel's history did not end there. As the great empires of Assyria and Babylon gained strength, Egypt often found itself entangled in their struggles for dominance. One of the most fateful encounters came during the reign of Pharaoh Necho II, whose actions would directly alter the course of Judah's history. Amid a larger conflict, Necho's military campaign led to the tragic death of one of Judah's last righteous kings, Josiah. This moment was yet another reminder of Egypt's persistent role in shaping the fate of Israel and its people. During the late 7th century BC, Pharaoh Necho II, a ruler of Egypt's 26th dynasty, set his sights on expanding Egypt's influence and countering the rising power of Babylon. Around the same time, the kingdom of Judah was undergoing a spiritual revival under King Josiah. Known for his deep commitment to God, Josiah led sweeping reforms to rid the land of idol worship and restore true worship among the people. His reign had brought hope and renewal to Judah, but it would end in an unexpected and tragic confrontation with Pharaoh Necho. Necho's ambitions stretched beyond Egypt's borders. He sought to march northward and support the Assyrians in their struggle against Babylon, aiming to slow Babylon's expansion and maintain Egypt's dominance in the region. To reach his objective, Necho's army needed to pass through the land of Judah, taking a route that would put him directly in Josiah's path. For reasons that are still debated, Josiah chose to oppose Necho's advance. Some scholars believe Josiah saw Egypt as a direct threat to Judah's sovereignty, while others suggest he viewed Necho's alliance with Assyria as standing against God's will. Whatever his reasoning, Josiah did not hesitate to act. The book of 2 Kings, chapter 23, verse 29, describes the pivotal moment. While Josiah was king, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the Euphrates River to help the king of Assyria. King Josiah marched out to meet him in battle, but Necho faced him and killed him at Megiddo. It was a stunning and tragic event. Josiah, a king who had faithfully followed God, was struck down in battle against Pharaoh Necho. The parallel account in 2 Chronicles chapter 35 verses 20 to 22 reveals an even more surprising detail. Necho had warned Josiah not to interfere. After all this, when Josiah had set the temple in order, Necho, king of Egypt, went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah marched out to meet him in battle. But Necho sent messengers to him, saying, "What quarrel is there, king of Judah, between you and me? It is not you I am attacking at this time, but the house with which I am at war. God has told me to hurry, so stop opposing God, who is with me, or he will destroy you." Despite this warning, Josiah chose to disguise himself and go into battle. He was mortally wounded, and his men rushed to bring him back to Jerusalem. But the damage was done. Josiah died from his injuries, and his loss was deeply mourned by the people of Judah. 2 Chronicles chapter 35 verse 24 records, "So they took him out of his chariot, put him in his other chariot, and brought him to Jerusalem, where he died. He was buried in the tombs of his ancestors, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for him." Josiah's death was more than just the loss of a king. It was a turning point for Judah. His successors failed to carry on his reforms, and the nation quickly fell into moral and political decline. Meanwhile, Pharaoh Necho continued his military campaign, and his influence over Judah only grew stronger. Shortly after Josiah's death, Necho deposed Josiah's son Jehoahaz after only 3 months on the throne. He then installed a puppet king of his choosing, Jehoiakim, another son of Josiah. The book of 2 Kings, chapter 23, verses 33-34, describes the event. Pharaoh Necho put him in chains at Riblah in the land of Hamath, so that he might not reign in Jerusalem, and he imposed on Judah a levy of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim the son of Josiah king in place of his father Josiah, and changed Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoahaz and carried him off to Egypt, and there he died. For a brief time, Necho had control over Judah's leadership, setting kings in place as he saw fit. However, his power over the region would not last. In 605 BC, at the Battle of Carchemish, Necho's forces were decisively defeated by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. This loss forced Egypt to retreat, and from that moment, Babylon became the dominant power in the region. Pharaoh Hophra and the fall of Jerusalem. As the kingdom of Judah approached its final days, the ancient Near East was dominated by two powerful empires, Babylon and Egypt. Babylon, under the rule of King Nebuchadnezzar II, had already established itself as the strongest force in the region, conquering nations and imposing its rule on weaker kingdoms. Egypt, though still influential, struggled to maintain its former dominance and frequently found itself in conflict with Babylon. It was during this period of political turmoil that Pharaoh Hophra, known historically as Wahibre Haebre, rose to power as the fourth ruler of Egypt's 26th dynasty. His reign would coincide with some of the most desperate moments in Judah's history. As Judah faced the growing threat of Babylon, its leaders sought allies in a last attempt to resist conquest. King Zedekiah, who ruled over Judah at this time, found himself caught between these two great powers, forced to make choices that would ultimately lead to the kingdom's destruction. Despite the warnings of the prophet Jeremiah, Zedekiah placed his trust in Pharaoh Hophra, hoping that Egypt's military strength would be enough to rescue Judah from Babylon's tightening grip. But this reliance on Egypt proved to be a grave mistake, setting the stage for the complete fall of Jerusalem and the exile of its people. Pharaoh Hophra ascended to the throne around 589 BC, inheriting a kingdom that was struggling to hold on to its influence in the face of Babylonian expansion. In earlier times, Egyptian pharaohs had exercised control over vast territories in Canaan, but by the time Hophra took power, Egypt's reach had significantly diminished. Meanwhile, Babylonian forces were extending their control deeper into the region, making Judah's position all the more precarious. King Zedekiah had been placed on the throne of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar himself after the Babylonian king removed Jehoiakim, the previous ruler. But like many kings before him, Zedekiah grew restless under Babylonian rule and sought a way to break free. Desperate for military support, he turned to Egypt, believing that Pharaoh Hophra could provide the protection Judah needed. The prophet Jeremiah, however, had repeatedly warned against this course of action, making it clear that relying on Egypt would only lead to disaster. In Jeremiah chapter 37, verse 7-8, God delivers a direct warning about Pharaoh Hophra's army. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of me, Pharaoh's army, which has marched out to support you, will go back to its land, to Egypt. Then the Babylonians will return and attack this city. They will capture it and burn it down. Even with this warning, Zedekiah chose to place his faith in Egypt's ability to intervene. At first, it seemed that Pharaoh Hophra might help Judah escape Babylon's grasp. Egyptian forces advanced toward Babylonian-occupied territory, forcing Nebuchadnezzar's army to momentarily withdraw from Jerusalem. But just as Jeremiah had prophesied, this moment of relief was brief. Pharaoh Hophra's army eventually retreated, leaving Judah vulnerable once again. Babylon quickly regrouped and returned to lay siege to Jerusalem, and this time the city could not withstand the attack. The tragic consequences of Judah's misplaced trust in Egypt would soon unfold, leading to the kingdom's destruction, the burning of Jerusalem, and the exile of its people, just as the prophet Jeremiah had foretold. The siege of Jerusalem was a nightmare beyond imagination. Babylon's army surrounded the city, cutting off food supplies and leaving the people to suffer from unbearable hunger. The streets that once bustled with life became filled with the cries of the starving, and desperation took hold of every household. Lamentations, chapter 4, verse 9 to 10, captures the unspeakable horrors endured by the people trapped inside the city walls. Those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of famine. Racked with hunger, they waste away for lack of food from the field. With their own hands, compassionate women have cooked their own children, who became their food when my people were destroyed. Zedekiah, who had placed all his hope in Pharaoh Hophra, soon realized the bitter truth. Egypt was not coming to his rescue. The Babylonian siege dragged on for nearly 2 years, and as time passed, starvation and disease claimed more lives than the sword. Then in 586 BC, the inevitable happened. Nebuchadnezzar's forces breached the walls of Jerusalem, pouring into the city like a flood. The destruction was swift and absolute. The temple of the Lord, the very heart of Judah's worship, was set on fire. The royal palace and every significant building were burned to the ground. What had once been a proud and holy city was reduced to ash and rubble. The book of 2 Kings, chapter 25, verse 9 to 10, recounts the devastation in heartbreaking detail. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army under the commander of the imperial guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. In the chaos, Zedekiah attempted to flee, hoping to escape the fate that awaited him, but his efforts were futile. The Babylonians captured him near Jericho, and what followed was a punishment worse than death. Before his very eyes, his sons were executed, ensuring that his royal line would be erased forever. Then, as if to cement his suffering, he was blinded and led away in chains to Babylon, where he would live the rest of his days as a prisoner, his final memories filled with the last sight of his sons being slaughtered. Meanwhile, Pharaoh Hophra, the ruler who had failed to come to Judah's aid, found himself powerless in the face of Babylon's strength. His promises of military support had offered Judah nothing but false hope, and his failure to act had helped seal Jerusalem's fate. Egypt, once a mighty empire feared throughout the ancient world, had been exposed as weak and unable to stand against the rising power of Babylon. Hophra's downfall was not only a military and political failure, but also the fulfillment of divine prophecy. The prophet Jeremiah had spoken clearly about his fate, warning that Egypt's ruler would fall just as Zedekiah had. Jeremiah chapter 44, verse 30, records the chilling words of the Lord. "This is what the Lord says. I am going to deliver Pharaoh Hophra, king of Egypt, into the hands of his enemies, just as I gave Zedekiah, king of Judah, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the enemy who sought his life." Not long after the fall of Jerusalem, Hophra faced turmoil in his kingdom. His leadership had been weak and his people had lost confidence in him. As Egypt continued to decline, the dissatisfaction grew into open rebellion. Amasis, one of his military officials, led an uprising against him. The Egyptian army, once loyal to Hophra, turned against him and threw their support behind Amasis. In 570 BC, Hophra was overthrown, and Amasis seized the throne for himself. At first, Hophra was spared and placed under house arrest, but his fate would not end in exile. Eventually, he met a violent death, either assassinated by his enemies or executed as a traitor. In the end, Jeremiah's prophecy had come to pass. The once powerful Pharaoh was handed over to his adversaries, just as Zedekiah had been. With Hophra's fall, Egypt's influence in the region collapsed completely. The days when Egypt held dominion over nations like Judah were over, and from that point on, Egypt would never again rise to prominence in biblical history. Babylon had taken center stage, and the people of Judah were now scattered, living as exiles in a foreign land. This is the end. If you've made it this far and found value in this message but haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button, turn on all notifications, and give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us reach more people with this content. Thank you for being part of this journey, and may God bless you.